Start with the claim, not the theatrics. A sudden refinery shutdown throwing California into chaos makes for a great headline, but it misleads in a very specific way. Nothing about this situation is sudden, and nothing about it is accidental. What's happening is the slow collision between California's energy policy and the physical reality of how gasoline markets actually work. The panic narrative obscures the mechanism, so let's strip it down. California is not like other states when it comes to fuel. It operates a semi-island gasoline market with its own boutique fuel blends, strict environmental specifications, and limited pipeline connections to the rest of the country. That means most of the gasoline burned in California has to be refined in California or shipped in by tanker at higher cost. There is no large, flexible national market swooping in overnight to stabilize prices when something goes wrong. When refining capacity tightens here, prices spike. That's not ideology, that's infrastructure. So when a major refinery announces it's winding down operations, even on a multi-year timeline, the political system reacts as if the building is already on fire. Not because officials are irrational, but because they understand how thin the margin is. California's system runs hot. A few percentage points of capacity loss can move prices fast, especially during peak demand. That's the background condition most coverage ignores. Now enter the governor. Every headline frames this as a personal crisis for Gavin Newsom, as if this were about temperament or mismanagement in the moment. That's convenient. It turns a structural problem into a personality story. But the governor didn't wake up one morning to a surprise shutdown notice. The major refinery decisions driving this moment have been telegraphed for years. Companies have been warning investors, regulators, and anyone paying attention that California refining is a shrinking business. Take the Benicia facility owned by Valero Energy. This isn't a plant that blew a gasket and shut down overnight. It's a refinery being deliberately idled because its owners see no future return on the billions of dollars required to keep it compliant, competitive, and politically tolerated in California over the next 2 decades. That decision reflects expectations about policy, demand, and risk. It is forward-looking, not reactive. Here's the core tension. California wants gasoline consumption to decline steadily on the road to electrification and net zero emissions. At the same time, it still needs tens of millions of gallons of gasoline every day to keep the economy functioning. Those two facts coexist uncomfortably. If you're a refiner, that combination looks like a trap. You're being told demand will disappear, regulation will intensify, and political hostility will increase. But you're also being asked implicitly to maintain flawless supply to prevent price spikes. That's not a stable investment environment. That's a signal to exit. The panic framing also serves another purpose. It lets everyone pretend this is about short-term crisis management rather than long-term design. If the story is that officials are scrambling to manage an unexpected disruption, then no one has to ask why the system is built so tightly that it can't absorb predictable exits. No one has to confront the contradiction of discouraging supply while depending on it. And this is where the refinery shutdown becomes more than an energy story. It's a political economy story about incentives. Refiners respond to profit expectations. Politicians respond to price spikes and voter anger. Climate policy operates on long timelines, while fuel markets react instantly. When those timelines aren't aligned, you get recurring crises that look like surprises, but aren't. So before we talk about blame or competence or panic, we need to understand the structure California has built for itself. A structure where every refinery exit becomes a mini emergency, where imports are the fallback, and where the public is told the transition will be smooth even as the underlying system grows more fragile. That sets up the next question. What exactly is being lost as these refineries wind down? And why does even a single closure matter so much? To understand why California reacts so sharply to refinery closures, you have to look at scale and timing, not slogans. Refining capacity isn't abstract. It's measured in barrels per day, and California doesn't have much slack. When even one large facility exits, the system tightens immediately, not just on paper, but at the pump. Start with the concrete cases. The most discussed right now is the Benicia Refinery, operated by Valero Energy in the Bay Area. This is not a small plant. It has historically processed roughly 145,000 barrels of crude oil per day. That's a meaningful chunk of Northern California's gasoline supply. Valero has announced it will stop refining crude there by 2026, transitioning the site toward import and distribution instead. In other words, fewer barrels refined in-state, more fuel shipped in from elsewhere. Then there's Southern California. Phillips 66 shut down refining operations at its Los Angeles area facility, removing another large slice of capacity from the system. Combined, these exits represent roughly 15% of California's total refining capacity. That number matters. California already runs with less buffer than almost any other major fuel market in the country. This is where percentages beat headlines. Gasoline prices don't respond linearly to supply losses. Lose 1 or 2% of capacity, and the system absorbs it. Lose 10 to 15% in a market with limited imports, custom fuel blends, and high demand, and prices don't just creep up, they jump. The market anticipates scarcity well before the last barrel stops flowing. Traders price in future tightness. Wholesalers adjust contracts. Retailers pass it on. And none of this is happening because refineries are suddenly unprofitable in a narrow sense. California gasoline margins have often been among the highest in the country. That's the paradox people miss. These companies are not leaving because they can't make money this year. They're leaving because they don't believe the political and regulatory environment will allow them to recover the massive capital costs required to keep operating over the next 10 to 20 years. A refinery isn't a light switch. It's a multi-billion-dollar industrial system that requires constant reinvestment, environmental upgrades, safety compliance, equipment replacement. In California, those costs are higher, approvals are slower, and the long-term demand signal is explicitly downward. State policy is very clear. Gasoline is a sunset product. If you're an executive deciding where to allocate capital globally, that matters more than today's margins. So when politicians say, why are these companies shutting down when prices are high? The answer is simple. Because they're planning for the future, not the next quarter. They're responding rationally to incentives. California is telling them, in policy language, that they are not wanted long-term. They're acting accordingly. It's also important to be precise about who made these decisions. These are corporate board decisions, driven by investor expectations and regulatory forecasts. The governor didn't order refineries to close, but the policy environment created the conditions in which closing became the rational move. That distinction matters because it shifts the debate from personal blame to structural design. And once a refinery shuts down, it almost never comes back. Restarting or rebuilding capacity in California is politically and financially near impossible. Permitting a loan can take years. Community opposition is fierce. Capital markets are hostile. So every closure is effectively permanent. This is why officials react so strongly even to announced gradual shutdowns. They understand that each exit ratchets the system into a tighter, more fragile state. Imports can fill some gaps, but they come with higher costs, longer supply chains, and more exposure to global disruptions. California is trading local control for external dependence. So part two isn't about shock, it's about arithmetic. How many barrels are leaving, how hard they are to replace, and why the system was never designed to lose them smoothly. That leads directly to the deeper question. What kind of incentive structure produces a market where supply exits are predictable, rational, and still politically explosive? Once you stop treating refinery closures as isolated corporate decisions, the real driver comes into focus: incentives. Not speeches, not intentions, not press releases, incentives. California has built an energy policy framework that tells refiners very clearly that their business has no long-term future in the state. The surprise isn't that companies are leaving. The surprise would be if they stayed. Look at the policy stack. California runs a cap-and-trade system that steadily raises the cost of emitting carbon. It enforces one of the most aggressive low-carbon fuel standards in the world, which penalizes petroleum-based fuels relative to alternatives. It layers on state-level environmental review, local permitting hurdles, and constant regulatory revision. None of these policies are accidental. They are designed to push gasoline out of the system over time. Now add the explicit timeline. California law commits the state to carbon neutrality by 2045 and bans the sale of new gasoline-powered cars by 2035. Whether those goals are fully achieved or not is almost beside the point. For investors, the signal is unmistakable. Demand will be politically suppressed, not merely shaped by consumer choice. That creates what economists call regulatory risk. The possibility that future rules will wipe out returns on long-lived assets. Refineries are exactly that kind of asset. They are expensive, immobile, and designed to operate for decades. If you are being asked to pour billions of dollars into upgrades today, while the state is openly planning a future in which your core product is phased out, the math doesn't work. Even if current profits are strong, the expected lifetime return collapses once you discount for policy risk. This is the quiet contradiction at the heart of California's energy strategy. The state wants fuel supply to remain perfectly stable, no price spikes, no shortages, no political backlash, while simultaneously making that supply less attractive to produce. Those two goals pull in opposite directions. Markets don't resolve that contradiction. They respond by exiting. Officials often respond by accusing refiners of price gouging or bad faith. That rhetoric plays well politically, but it doesn't change incentives. You cannot threaten an industry with extinction and then act shocked when it stops reinvesting. Calling it greed doesn't make the barrels reappear. There's another layer here that rarely gets discussed: uncertainty. It's not just that regulation is strict, it's that it's unpredictable. Refiners don't know what the rules will look like in 5 or 10 years. Will carbon prices spike? Will new blending mandates be imposed? Will refineries be forced to convert or shut down early? That uncertainty itself has a cost. Capital flees uncertainty faster than it flees regulation. This is why high gasoline prices don't save the system. In a normal market, high prices attract new supply. In California, they don't. The policy framework blocks that response. New refineries aren't built. Old ones aren't expanded. Instead, high prices become a political problem to manage, not a market signal to respond to. The result is a shrinking domestic supply base paired with continued demand. Electrification is advancing, but slowly. Millions of vehicles will still require gasoline well into the 2030s and beyond. Yet the state is behaving as if supply can be turned down faster than demand. That gap doesn't disappear. It shows up as volatility. And here's the key point. This outcome is not a failure of policy implementation. It is the logical result of the policy design. When you discourage investment in supply without providing a fully functional replacement, you create fragility. When something breaks, everyone acts surprised, even though the incentives guaranteed it would happen. So when refineries announce closures years in advance, they're not issuing threats. They're reading the same policy documents everyone else is. They're responding rationally to a system that tells them, you are temporary. That brings us to the political response. If the incentive structure is driving exits, what can politicians actually do when the consequences start hitting voters at the pump? Once the consequences show up at the pump, the political logic flips. The same officials who spent years signaling that fossil fuel infrastructure should wind down suddenly find themselves trying to keep it alive just long enough to avoid backlash. This is where the public messaging and the private actions diverge sharply. Publicly, the response is moral and rhetorical. There are accusations of price gouging, threats of windfall profit taxes, and talk of corporate irresponsibility. The villain is always the refiner. This framing is useful because it avoids the harder admission that the system was designed to shrink supply before demand was ready to follow. Blame is easier than redesign. Privately, the response is pragmatic. State officials lean on refiners to delay closures, keep units running longer, or convert facilities into import terminals rather than fully shutting them down. This is exactly what happened with the Benicia refinery operated by Valero Energy. The state didn't reverse its climate goals. It negotiated for continuity. Keep the fuel flowing, even if it has to come from somewhere else. That somewhere else is the global gasoline market. When California loses refining capacity, it doesn't magically stop consuming fuel. It imports it. Tankers bring gasoline from the Gulf Coast, Asia, or even Europe. On paper, this looks like a solution. In reality, it's a downgrade. Imported fuel is more expensive. Shipping costs add volatility. Supply chains stretch across oceans and through geopolitical risk. Weather events, labor disputes, or conflicts thousands of miles away can now move California gas prices. The state trades local industrial capacity for dependence on external markets it doesn't control. There's also an emissions contradiction that rarely gets acknowledged. Shutting down local refineries doesn't eliminate emissions. It displaces them. Fuel refined overseas is often produced under weaker environmental standards, then shipped long distances on carbon-intensive vessels. The emissions don't disappear. They just move off the state's balance sheet. That's not decarbonization. That's accounting. Who pays for this adjustment? Not policymakers, not refiners who exit early. Consumers do. Drivers, especially lower and middle-income households, absorb higher and more volatile prices. Small businesses with vehicle fleets take the hit, and neighboring states like Nevada and Arizona, which rely on California's fuel system, feel the ripple effects. This is a regional tax imposed by structural scarcity. When prices spike, the political system reaches for emergency tools. Investigations, hearings, calls for transparency. These gestures create the impression of action, but they don't add a single barrel of supply. They manage anger, not infrastructure. This is why the panic narrative keeps returning. Each disruption is treated as an isolated crisis rather than a predictable outcome of a tightening system. Officials scramble, issue statements, negotiate behind closed doors, and then move on without resolving the underlying mismatch between policy timelines and physical demand. The deeper problem is that there's no honest bridge strategy. Electrification is the stated destination, but gasoline remains the bridge fuel, and the bridge is being dismantled plank by plank while traffic is still crossing. Imports are the temporary patch, but they lock in higher costs and less control. So the political response becomes a cycle: discourage supply, experience shortages, blame refiners, import fuel, repeat. Everyone acts as if the next time will be different. That leaves the final question hanging. If this is the trajectory, what does California's fuel system look like 5 or 10 years from now? And who ends up winning and losing as this squeeze becomes permanent? Project this forward, and the pattern is hard to avoid. California is moving toward a fuel system that is smaller, more fragile, and more expensive, not because of some sudden failure, but because that is exactly what the current trajectory produces. More refinery closures are likely, not all at once, not announced dramatically, but steadily, as each operator reaches the same conclusion: staying is riskier than leaving. Electrification will continue, but it will not move fast enough to eliminate gasoline demand on the state's preferred timeline. Millions of internal combustion vehicles will remain on the road well into the 2030s. Heavy-duty transport, aviation, agriculture, and construction will rely on liquid fuels even longer. That means demand declines slowly while supply is being discouraged aggressively. The gap between the two doesn't close, it widens. In that environment, price volatility becomes normal. Not an emergency, not a spike that needs investigation, but a permanent feature. Any disruption, a refinery outage, a shipping delay, a heat wave, ripples through the system. California drivers are told to expect higher prices as part of the transition, but the distributional effects are rarely confronted honestly. Wealthier households absorb it. Lower-income households reorganize their lives around it. So who wins? Refiners that exit early do. They avoid future regulatory risk, avoid sunk capital costs, and often repurpose assets into import or logistics hubs that still generate revenue with far less exposure. Global fuel traders win. Importers win. The more California depends on external supply, the more leverage those players have. Who loses is just as clear. Consumers lose stability. The state loses control over a critical piece of its energy infrastructure. And politically, leaders lose credibility every time they promise a smooth transition while managing another unexpected crisis. There is also a strategic loss. Energy systems are about resilience, not just emissions. By hollowing out in-state refining before replacements are fully scaled, California makes itself more vulnerable to global shocks, to geopolitical tensions, to forces entirely outside its regulatory reach. That vulnerability doesn't show up in climate targets, but it shows up in household budgets. None of this means the energy transition is wrong. It means the sequencing is. Transitions fail when they ignore physical constraints. You can change incentives faster than you can change infrastructure, but markets respond to incentives immediately. That's the lesson being demonstrated here, over and over. The refinery shutdown headlines will keep coming. Each one will be framed as a new crisis, a new failure, a new reason for outrage. But they are all variations of the same story. A system being tightened before it's ready to let go. Until California confronts that reality and designs a transition that aligns supply, demand, and timelines, the panic won't disappear. It will just become routine.